today we are talking kind of generally about education in like a historical context, and we'll talk a little bit about present like statistics and things like that that are more situated in current Indian country. I also, when I just put this on, I realized that I had changed the title of this, so this is not my most recent version. So if I go off script, it's because I changed something and it's not here. So sorry about that. So first we're going to talk a little bit about kind of what led up to boarding school era, which we did talk a little bit about last week. So first, just to kind of give you a sense of like how Indian education started in the United States in particular. It wasn't just here, with what we were talking about last week with, Eliot and Mayhew on the Vineyard, but all over the country, different groups were educating different groups of Native people, for the most part with various religious content for these schools that they're setting up. So on the West Coast, you have Jesuits in the mid to late 1500s. Actually, before that, in central Mexico, the Franciscan schools were the early part of the 1500s. And then our education starts to come to the East Coast. So we've got Jesuit missions in the Midwest, kind of coming in by way of Canada, and then 1600s here as well. And again, I won't go through too much of that because we talked about that last week, but also in Virginia as well, right? So there's Protestant missions happening in Virginia around the same time that missions were being set up in this area. We also talked a little bit about Harvard last week, right? With the Darius talked about Joel Hayakumis, who received a posthumous degree from Harvard, 8 or something years ago. Harvard Indian School was set up in 1665 under Harvard's original charter to educate the Native population of the area. There was one undergraduate graduate in 1665. That was the first Wampanoag person to graduate from Harvard. The second Wampanoag person to graduate from Harvard, 346 years later, was Tiffany Smalley, who's a Quinnipiac woman who graduated in 2011. And these are undergrads, so there have been graduate students in the interim. But given that the school was established for Native students, there's not a whole lot of follow-through on that original charter. A few other programs that early on were designed and designated for the education of Native students. William and Mary in the early 1700s in Dartmouth as well. Dartmouth was also founded to educate Native students as well. And this I just wanted to show because, so I'll read it in a moment, but so these schools were actively recruiting Native students or Native people from tribal areas to come to their schools. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that happened in a little bit, but here was a response from a leader of Six Nations Iroquois Confederacy to William and Mary. You who are wise must know that different nations have different conceptions of things, and you will therefore not take it amiss if our ideas of this kind of of education happen not to be the same with yours. We have had some experience of it. Several of our young people were formally brought up at the College of the Northern Provinces. They were instructed in all your sciences, but when they came back to us, they were bad runners, ignorant of every means of living in the woods, unable to bear either cold or hunger, knew neither how to build a cabin, take a deer, or kill an enemy, spoke our language imperfectly, were therefore neither fit for hunters, warriors, or counselors. They were totally good for nothing. We are, however, not the less obliged by your kind offer, though we decline accepting it, and to show our grateful sense of it, if the gentlemen of Virginia will send us a dozen of their sons, we will take great care of their education, instruct them in all we know, and make men of them.
Wow.
So
how old were was it like our college age then?
yeah, roughly. I think so. maybe a little bit younger. Yeah, but so, clearly you can see that from the beginning, the idea of a Western education wasn't necessarily what people wanted, right? So even though, we think nowadays of, Harvard or Dartmouth, right? Dartmouth was my first choice when I applied to college, so I get it, right? We think of these as like what we should be doing, what we want to be doing, but this obviously, like killing your enemy maybe is not what we're training people to do now, but the sentiment you can kind of still relate, right? The goal of Western education and the goal of people in tribal communities are not necessarily the same.
I'm wondering if Benjamin Franklin had any comments on that.
Right.
I'd like to know what his opinion was.
So this just sort of sets the background for kind of where we're coming from at this point. But so moving into boarding schools, in 1819, the Indian Civilization Fund Act supported religious groups that were interested and willing to educate Native people, and you could get up to $10,000 a year from this fund, which of course is pretty big money at that time. And in 1880, the Board of Indian Commissioners said, as a savage, we cannot tolerate him any more than as a half-civilized parasite, wanderer, or vagabond. The only alternative left is to fit him by education for civilized life. The Indian, though a simple child of nature, with mental facilities dwarfed and shriveled, while groping his way for generations in the darkness of barbarism, already sees the importance of education. And so, despite responses like William and Mary got from the Iroquois Confederacy, most of these institutions were pretty convinced that they were doing what needed to be done, what should be done, and what any Indian in their right mind would want, right? That was the belief. That they should want to be civilized. They should want, what everyone else was doing. The very first school was Carlisle Indian School. We talked a little bit about that last week. Carlisle Indian School was established in 1879 by Richard Henry Pratt. It was in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And it's the first school in the United States. I think it might be the first school overall, actually, because Canada followed the United States model, actually. So, and of course, many, many schools popped up after Carlisle. 408 total schools in the United States, which includes Alaska and Hawaii. And that's only across, I think, maybe 35 or 40 states or territories at the time. So it's not, they're fairly concentrated in certain areas. And then following the United States' lead, 139 government-run schools were established in Canada, but there are also several others that were not government-run. So we're talking about, probably nearly 1,000 schools that were dedicated to the mission of turning the picture on the left to the picture on the right, essentially, right? And the famous quote that I think we talked also about last week, maybe, was that the aim of these schools was to kill the Indian inside him and save the man. That was the purpose. And we're gonna watch a little clip in a while, right? That talks about how, so these schools are typically referred to as residential schools or boarding schools, but really they were concentration camps, right? The things that happened in these schools, it wasn't education, right? So Carlisle School closed in 1918. The last school to close in the United States was 1969, but I believe the last school to close in Canada was in the 90s, 98, I think, maybe. So we're not really talking about distant memory, distant past. The conditions of the boarding schools were really, deplorable by any standard. There was rampant physical and sexual abuse. And that abuse gave way to generational trauma that is still felt in communities across Indian country, both in the United States and in Canada. But some of the fallout from these schools, once children as young as 4 years old were taken from their homes, they would be brought to these schools where they couldn't interact with their family, couldn't go home, and so they were, in many cases, didn't have relationships with their families anymore. So once they did leave, they couldn't really go home, right? They didn't speak the same language. They didn't have relationships with their parents, with their siblings. But they also couldn't find their way in mainstream society either, right? And partly because, I think that's supposed to say when students graduate, they couldn't find jobs, but it's behind the picture there. So they were not, people were not able to integrate into mainstream society the way they were expected to once they left. And this, the boarding school era and people who came out of the boarding school era, because there was such a loss of specific identity as a result, but rather more of kind of a generalized pan-Indian identity. That's sort of what gave way to what we know today as the pan-Indian movement, which is sort of a collective identity as Native, more so in some areas, and particularly in urban areas, as opposed to identities of specific tribal affiliations. So for the next little bit, we got a video to watch. This is a interview, series of interviews that aired on NBC this past fall. So I don't know if anybody may have seen it. It is one of several that have happened, I think, probably in the last couple of years, as a result of, we'll talk about this in a minute, but the graves that were found a few years ago. Does everyone remember seeing that on the news? Yeah. So there's a little bit of an uptick in attention to this history since those were uncovered. So hopefully this works the way I want it to. This video is about 25 minutes, so.
A reckoning more than a century in the making.
America had hidden the truth from America.
As an award-winning NBC News investigative team heads to the South Dakota Badlands and the Pine Ridge Reservation to hear their untold stories.
I don't want to repeat it.
Of children forcibly taken from their homes and abused.
I became a shallow breather, thinking that if I don't breathe loud, I might disappear.
And to uncover painful truths.
Enrich us in what we do.
Sidestep my question. To bear witness to an unspeakable chapter in America's history.
They are being rapidly brought from their state of savagery and barbarism to one of civilization.
It's hard to know what genocide is if this isn't it. Make sense of a policy of the U.S. government that forcibly separated an estimated 100,000 children from their parents, withheld food from those who protested or threw them in jail, that took those often traumatized children, some as young as 4, to boarding schools where their language was forbidden and their beliefs rejected, where the death rate far exceeded those of white children, and where abuse, both physical and sexual, was commonplace. What to call such a system? Those who created it back in the mid-1800s called it the Federal Indian Boarding School System. But perhaps it should have been called an instrument of American genocide. About 100 miles from Mount Rushmore, a sovereign nation stretches out in South Dakota. Beyond the Rocky Badlands, the Pine Ridge Reservation, home to the Lakota and one of the poorest places in America. This cemetery tucked behind the Red Cloud Indian School is in many ways symbolic of a much wider reckoning, dating back 150 years. This was one of the Native American boarding schools then called Holy Rosary Mission, sanctioned by the federal government and run by the Catholic Church. These schools articulated mission, kill the Indian in him, and save the man. And this is where Marcia Small enters the story, a Northern Cheyenne woman who we first met here 6 months ago.
I get really emotional in these places. The work we do is sacred. It will move us toward a horizon of healing. There's so much to be done. It's overwhelming at times. And if we don't all step to the plate, the nation itself, the United States of America, it will not heal.
Small is the only Native person in the U.S. leading the painstaking process of using ground-penetrating radar to help heal wounds of a painful past, by looking for the unmarked graves of lost Indigenous children who may be buried at schools like this one. How might it have happened? Beginning in the early 1800s, the U.S. government set up over 400 boarding schools across 37 states, some of which operated through 1969. About half of the schools were run by religious groups, many of which received federal payment per student.
Through the agencies of the government, they are being rapidly brought from their state of comparative savagery and barbarism to one of civilization.
These unpublished outtakes from a 1929 newsreel show just how clear the government was in its efforts to force Native children to give up their culture.
These children, but a few years ago, looked just like those we saw before. But today they all speak English, and some have taken business courses. We bring them in, clean them up, and start them on their way to civilization.
And the policy wasn't only designed to extinguish their beliefs, but to also make it easier for the government to take their land. In a 1969 Senate report, boarding school education was explicitly described as a weapon by which these goals were to be accomplished. What did it feel like to be trapped inside that system? We spoke to several former boarding school students, many of them telling their story for the first time publicly.
When I called him very sadistic because he took pleasure in spanking us.
89-year-old Basil Braveheart remembers being physically abused at Jesuit-run Red Cloud when he was a student, beginning in the late 1930s. The memory of being punished by a nun for speaking Lakota has stayed with him all these years.
She took out a rubber band. I want you to bite this rubber band with your teeth. And I want you to pull it as far as you can and let it go. The pain on my lips, physical pain.
But worse than the pain of that moment,
my friends laughed at me. To have your peers laugh at you goes to the deepest part of who you are. It's shaming.
And very effective in getting you not to speak your language, I imagine. Braveheart was just 6 years old when he was sent away to school here. He says he now knows his family had no choice but to send him.
And if they didn't do it, Indian policemen will come and look for you, horseback, and they will find you. They told us that if you keep violating this, they mark you down and they weaponize rations.
Food?
Yes.
You either send the kid or we'll track you down with the police,
Right.
We'll cut your food rations. So really, they didn't have a choice.
I didn't understand that.
Did you feel betrayed when they sent you?
I felt betrayed by my grandparents and my parents. But afterwards, they were following a policy to survive.
At school, he remembers his hair was immediately cut, which is only done in the Lakota tradition when a very close relative dies.
Very soon after we got to the school, I got a haircut.
Do you remember how that felt?
Pehing, which means hair, is very sacred. I remember my grandma said, when you cut your hair, we put that in a cloth and we give it to Grandpa. And whenever there is a sacred fire, the smoke becomes spirit from the hair that transcends and becomes one with the uncreated divinity.
Well, I take it that the Jesuits were not saving your hair so that it could be used in a ceremony.
No. It fell on the floor and they were walking on it. That to me was a deep spiritual violation in this respect.
As we spoke, Braveheart revealed a hidden trauma that he's lived with since he was a child.
When I was in a dormitory when I was 8, 9 years old, and every night after the lights goes out, when a person walks in it, you can hear the squeaking. That squeaking, it still is a trigger for me.
One of the authorities at the school would come into the boys' dorm at night. For what purpose?
Looking for little boys.
To have sex with, presumably.
That's it. I became a shallow breather, thinking that if I don't breathe loud, I might disappear.
He was not alone. Just this year, a government report concluded that physical and sexual abuse was rampant at the schools. Braveheart's classmate Robert Strikes Lightning was sent to Red Cloud in 1943. He says he was 13 when a priest hit him with a sash lined with metal pellets.
He was big and strong then. He said, "You won't be able to sit for a week." He was right. I had blisters on my backside.
And that wasn't the only time.
We'd go in his office, and he would say, "You know why you're here? Now grab your ankles." We'd bend over and grab our ankles. He had a big black strap back there, and he'd take that off. He'd grab your ankles, and he'll hit you till he sweated.
About a decade later, Cecilia Firethunder, now 76, attended Red Cloud with her 3 sisters.
My dad and my mom made a decision to put us here for economic reasons. In the 50s and 60s, there was no economy, there was no jobs, and so they had children to feed. And then that's the big girls' dormitory.
We talked in the shadow of what had been the girls' dormitory when she was there. She told us she was never beaten, but was punished by the nuns for speaking Lakota.
That was the rule on the little girl side. You cannot speak Lakota.
Do you speak the language still?
I never forgot my language.
Firethunder remembers the way her grandmother encouraged her to hold on to her Lakota identity.
You had to live a double life here. You had to behave by all the rules, but keep your own self in there.
We knew we had no power. The nuns were power. You can't fight it, so what do? Just get by. Just get by.
Firethunder worked as a nurse before rising to become the first female president of the Ogallala Sioux tribe in 2004. Looking back, she says, growing up, separated from her mother, meant that she struggled to nurture her own children.
Well, do you feel you were a bad mother?
Of course I did. Of course I felt I was a bad mother, because then I screamed and yelled and punished my kids.
And then that's what you knew.
That's what they showed us.
Alex Whiteplume is also a former president of the tribe, although he attended 2 boarding schools elsewhere.
The beatings were usually they grab you by the ear and they jerk you down to the principal's office, or they grab you by the arm so hard that they leave fingerprints on your arms. And we were little guys, and that pain would last for days. And you got to a point where you didn't want to tell your dad or mom because they couldn't do nothing. It's just waste. So we just had to go along with it, and it was accepted.
Did you ever get hit with a strap or that sort of stuff?
No, the beatings, that was my mom and dad's generation that were beat. It was a little bit lenient when I grew up.
Have they told you about what happened to them?
Yeah. I don't want to repeat it.
The trauma manifested now in other ways, says Braveheart.
Students I went with, especially the boys, all of them drink. He drank using it as a medicine to tame their feelings.
And it continues today.
What this facility did and other facilities did toward people, it still affects us to this day through poverty, suicide, addiction, many other things.
Eleanor Ferguson told us she's trying to understand her own hurt.
I had to go deep within and realize that it was the church who, installed these traumas within my bloodline. It wasn't my family's fault. So I had to stop blaming them for my hurt and my pain and my suffering.
For the first time in history, both the Secretary of the Interior and the Assistant Secretary for Indian Affairs are Native Americans themselves. And yet, nearly 2 years into the administration, the Interior Department is still tallying up how many schools were involved and how many children died. Meanwhile, Canada, which modeled its boarding school system on the U.S., has already paid billions in reparations. And thanks to Indigenous leaders there, the Pope even traveled to Canada to apologize for the Church's role in what he calls genocide. These are the voices of some of those who attended such schools.
America has hidden the truth from America.
Yeah, physical abuse, mental abuse, you name it.
I became a shallow breather, thinking that if I don't breathe loud, I might disappear.
While we were at Red Cloud last spring, Brian Newland, the Assistant Secretary of the Interior for Indian Affairs, himself a Native American, showed up unexpectedly. How do you personally feel about this effort to locate possibility of children's bodies using this machinery?
Well, it's deeply personal. There hasn't been one single Indian person in this country who's not living with the impacts of and the legacy of these boarding schools where people didn't make it home from these schools. The number of kids who were taken against their will and against their families' wills to be placed into these schools is countless.
But there is a number. One expert says at least 100,000 children were legally removed from their families by the federal government, and 40,000 died. That death rate significantly higher than that of white children at the same time. And while Newland authored the Interior Department report last year, which concluded there were 408 federal boarding schools, much is still left unresolved. For example, the report never uses the word genocide.
Why is the word genocide hard to say?
You have to tell the story first and acknowledge first before then you can begin to move on, reconcile, and build back what was torn down.
But that is not a satisfactory answer to many of those we talked to. Alex Whitebloom, the former president of the tribe, confronted the assistant secretary.
And we're not going to heal until we see some type of justice by the United States.
There were a lot of pleasantries until you stood up.
Yeah. Well, I had to correct the history. What we're sitting on here is a Roman Catholic Church land, stolen in our treaty territory. And then the Assistant Secretary of Interior saying, we're going to bring you money, we're going to increase your law enforcement, we're going to bring your language back. That just ticked me off something awful. And so he's not telling the truth. He should face up to the truth. And America should face up to the truth. The American genocide should be a topic that everybody discusses daily.
So you heard a former president of this tribe say, we want to hear the word genocide.
The purpose of these schools was forcible assimilation to separate Indian people from their lands.
It's hard to know what genocide is if this isn't it.
Again, we have to tell the whole story. And in tribal communities, families and people know exactly what happened to them. But what we need to do on behalf of the federal government is to paint the picture and acknowledge our own role. And we're at step one.
But why only step one, when the Canadians who modeled their boarding school system on the U.S. have already called it cultural genocide and agreed to pay out billions in reparations? Pope Francis even traveled to Canada this past summer on a penance tour to apologize for the Church's role in the abuse.
For the deplorable behavior of those members of the Catholic Church, I ask forgiveness from God. And I'd like to tell you from the bottom of my heart that I am very pained.
Meanwhile, the U.S. government is still investigating. And Red Cloud is conducting its own investigation.
I think the boarding schools play an outsized role in the intergenerational traumas that plague our Native communities. That's going to take a long time to undo some of that damage.
McCall Black Elk is leading an effort at Red Cloud, still a Jesuit school, with the difficult task they're calling Truth and Healing.
We're the first former Catholic Indian boarding school to be engaged in this effort, in this way and to be this far along. And hopefully we can show people that it's possible.
Marcia Small's work is part of this process, which the Jesuits at Red Cloud are helping to pay for.
Keep your heart good, keep your mind clear.
On a recent cold October morning at Red Cloud, Marcia Small continued her part in helping reveal what happened here.
My heart physically hurt. I feel empowered, but for some reason I feel incredibly sad. Just so sad right now.
Down these narrow basement steps, Small led the first public excavation of a former Native American boarding school, where an eyewitness said he saw unmarked graves decades ago. With the FBI present, Small's team shoveled away layers of earth and sifted through sand, looking for what could be remains of Indigenous children.
My ancestors put me here, and that's why I do this. We had to start somewhere, and we're here.
While she's not yet found any children's remains here, she believes there will be many unmarked graves in the cemetery, where she intends to return in the spring.
All I do is work for the ancestors. I work for the stolen and kidnapped children. If I can do that, if I can bring recognition, then I will.
Some of the next generation here believe the whole process is moving much too slowly.
What I see as change is we want our babies back. It wasn't right for the school to take our children and to assimilate us. We want to hold this school accountable.
We sat down with Philip Ironshell. His partner is Eleanor Ferguson. They're part of an Indigenous youth group that protested on horseback while Newland was on campus.
When we ride these horses, it's also really empowering to us as Lakota people. They're really sacred to us.
Would you like to see the Jesuits leave here?
Yes.
This is the census number.
Yeah.
Black Elk knows all too well how many divisions there are, even within the community. His mother is a Lakota activist and his father was a former Catholic monk. There are still about 1,000 Catholics in the community of approximately 20,000.
There are some people who don't like the Jesuits being involved in all of this. The perpetrators, in some larger sense, are involved in the process.
The Jesuits and the Catholic Church have their own healing to do. They have to face this history and their role in it as perpetrators. There is healing, too, for the perpetrator.
But critics say this amounts to the church investigating itself. Father Peter Klink has been at Red Cloud for more than 40 years.
There are many in this community who feel the Jesuits are the bad guy, that the Jesuits should go.
At least from what I've tried to do ever since I came in 1975, was to do that lifting of the horizon of hope.
I think you just sidestepped my question.
Well, I feel badly if people feel that way. I would love to see us be able to enter into a dialogue, either to end up together concluding the Jesuits should go, or to find the ways in which we can, in fact, join hands.
Father Klink arrived 6 years after the federal boarding school system ended and says he never witnessed any abuse. But he feels strongly that the community needs to face its past, even if that means digging in the cemetery or elsewhere on campus.
If we don't dig, if we don't find, then in fact, I don't know how we deal honestly with the past. Otherwise, we can't grow into the future that we hope we can grow into.
As brokenhearted as you would be by that.
I would be crushed to find out that we've got a lot of kids buried around here, but yet I don't think there's any way we can be a part of this process and not pursue the truth.
Would you agree that the original purpose of schools like this was to kill the Indian and save the man? Would you consider it ethnic genocide?
Yeah, yes, because it was basically saying to them, you need to change. You're primitives. You know, that cultural genocide was the result of what we participated in. That's why the truth and healing process, which we began here prior to the Black Lives Matter movement, prior to the announcements in Canada, we had already decided that we were going to go through this because we need to deal honestly with that past before we can move to a vibrant future.
Red Cloud has made many changes. The Lakota language is now taught and celebrated in a first-of-its-kind program. The native language that the U.S. government once tried so hard to extinguish now reverberates around these classrooms.
Our people fought for us to speak this language, and they didn't want us to not speak this language, so we started speaking it so we could keep it, and we didn't make them fight for no reason.
Like all of those we met here, the legacy of the past is still very much alive for Basil Braveheart, a Korean War veteran who spent decades fighting to hold on to his Lakota identity.
I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, and I had a drinking problem. Someone told me, I said, you know, with your experience, you're kind of like a wounded healer. I think that's what I do, is to help people to become whole, to become free of trauma.
He asked us not to film him as he honored our team with a Lakota healing ceremony. The first time, he tells us, he's conducted one for non-Native people.
I'm just so curious about how you feel about America after everything you know, everything that has happened. I mean, you have an American flag over here, for example.
A combat veteran and Marine gave that flag to me. So I do care for my country.
You don't say love, you say care for. Is that the same?
Love.
You love it?
Yeah.
Do you also consider yourself an American?
I'm not an American, I'm a Lakota. I don't know what being an American means. This is my land, this is my homeland. However, I come from a family of veterans. World War II, Vietnam, Korea. You honor it because all your relatives went and fought.
Do you consider yourself an American?
No, I'm Lakota first. I served in the U.S. Army. First, I'm Oyuchbe, Lakota, Oglala. That's who I am. And then American can be fifth on that ladder.
White Plume wants the U.S. government to acknowledge what he says was stolen.
I will not accept a cheap apology. We want our treaty territories back. We just sit there and watch our people die in pain so they can take the land. It's a horrible story. America never owned up to the genocide, and this should be a general topic of discussion. We should deal with it.
Braveheart sees things differently and says his grandmother's wisdom continues to guide him.
And she's the one that told me that don't ever carry hate or prejudice because it's poison.
I mean, it's such a beautiful way to live. And yet it doesn't erase the trauma, does it? It doesn't erase the wrong, does it?
She said, you're going to remember Wounded Knee. You're going to remember what happened to you in boarding school.
But does that mean that the people who did the bad things, the wrong things, don't have to be held accountable?
She said the accountability is for us to let the divine take care of that. You probably will never forget what happened to you. They won't either. Mark my word. Here it is.
You're making me speechless, which is not a usual situation for me.
The wisdom that she taught me was to forgive the unforgivable.
Both men do agree on this. Much of the poverty and addiction, pain and struggle found here at Pine Ridge is a direct result of what many of the elders and those who came before them suffered under the boarding school system. Generational trauma is real. Healing will be complicated.
Just to kind of take education a little bit further. So towards the end of the boarding school era, there was a report published in 1928 called the Merriam Report, which was it was commissioned by the Institute of Government Research and funded by the Rockefeller Foundation. And it was handed over to the Secretary of the Interior to kind of just generally paint a picture of what Indian education was like at the time. And so it was not only focused on boarding schools, but just kind of education generally for Indigenous people at that time. And it uncovered some really, I think, for those who it was reported to and who were expecting it, really shocking conditions all around, not strictly focused on boarding schools, but it did, in some cases, lead to some amounts of change. And not much after the Merriam Report, John Collier, who was the Commissioner of Indian Affairs from 1933 to 1945, did start to make some changes. And so that's kind of the era where boarding schools started to be dismantled in the United States. Day schools became more popular, and some improvements were made, like around food and monitoring of disciplinary practices and things like that. So, yeah, just kind of pass that for now. But moving now into kind of the present and what was discussed just now in this video that we just watched. So Canada has really led the charge of the Truth and Reconciliation movement. And as was mentioned in the film, there's the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada that has focused, probably for a decade or so, I would say, on the kind of uncovering of the stories of boarding schools and the impacts that have taken hold in communities as a result. The graves that have been uncovered in the last, 2 or 3 years probably, at schools have, in the last I knew, I think the number was like around 5,000 or something, children they had found buried at schools. So just the fact that there are cemeteries at schools, right, is like, the fact that that's even a thing is, really obviously very problematic. But that sort of is what spurred the United States to start to take this on, as well as having a Secretary of the Interior who is Native. And so as you saw in the video, the Deputy Secretary of the Interior is not a favorite person, I think, around Indian country for this reason, has not really kind of been the representative that a lot of communities were hoping for by having Indigenous representation at that level. And the progress in general for bringing light to these, this story and this past has not been what it has been in Canada, and what people have hoped that it would be. Most of the things that most of the things that you might have seen either through social media or like Orange Shirt Day, right, that we had in Mashpee here in September, those are all things that have come out of Canada, that were started there. I recently heard a quote, and I can't remember where I heard it, so we'll just leave it unattributed here. But it was a man talking about the United States Truth and Reconciliation efforts and how, in reference to the Deputy Secretary not being able to really talk about the history, and saying that there is no reconciliation until there is truth. And so all of the efforts that they that are sort of being said to be made, right, is really lip service, because there's really no real effort to get at actual history, right, by not using the word genocide, for example. Okay, so actually, before we go on to kind of the current state, there's some questions here that I put in the back, so we can either look at these sort of guiding questions, or if anyone has questions or comments or anything at this point.
Was it pretty widespread throughout the United States, or were there certain tribes? Was it certain tribes that were more affected?
Mostly west of Mississippi, but there's a few scattered east, but largely they're on like kind of the larger reservation areas, in California as well. And there actually there are some schools that were residential schools that do still remain, but they're they're no longer like government run, but they are still like boarding schools that are usually in most cases at this point run by tribes. Schools.
What does the tribe know about how many children were taken from the Wampanoag people?
I don't know those numbers exactly. I know that we did have a number of people that went to Carlisle in, I think, the like late 1800s. I don't really know the numbers. Do you know those numbers, Roxanne, approximately? No, I don't know either.
But it was widespread enough to assume that it was prevalent.
Yeah, and part of, I do know that part of our petition for federal recognition and land and trust, like the presence of Wampanoag people, Wampanoag students or children, not students really, at Carlisle was used as part of our like proof of being like a government entity or whatever, a government board at like continuously through that time. So there was enough students there to sort of, to make that case that it was like, kind of a consistent relationship that, that the government was overseeing us at that time. So I'm going to go back to here. So this, these next slides are going to probably be hard to see, so I'll just kind of read them out. But it's a bunch of statistics that are more current. So that are, I think this was 2019, I believe these statistics are from. And as you probably know, education statistics for Native students are nearly impossible to really nail down, especially in this area where there are smaller populations, because I think there's like a 10% threshold of a population, either in the state or in the school or whatever, before they start to, label, like tallying statistics for that group, which in this area we don't really need. So these are mostly over like throughout the country. These are particular to the United States, and just kind of as a general, like, FYI, statistics in Canada are a little bit easier to get your hands on, not a lot. So this is students that are in special education. And so here we've got, so this is percentage alongside, so this is white students at 8%. Whoops, dang it. White students at 8%, Black students at 11%, Hispanic at 8%, Asian at 5%, and American Indian Alaska Native 14%. And here, okay, so this is over time. So this is 1998 to 2006, and this one that starts second to highest and goes up to highest, that's Native students. So begins at like about just under 10 and ends probably at like, 14. Right? So it's been on the increase for the past, 10 years at this time. Math and reading achievement. So we've got 4th grade and 8th grade. I don't know which one is math and which is reading, if that's the case. But so the dark is Native American students by comparison to the total number of students. So in 4th grade, the score, this is the score on this side, this is 96, 2000, 2005, 2007. So the scores are below the average across the board, right? No data here, but they're below in every category, in every year. This one's absenteeism. Again, so this is all students, white students, Black students, Hispanic, Asian, American Indian, Alaska Native. This is absenteeism. So it's 66%, as opposed to these numbers are all like in the mid-50s. And then for Asian students, it's 36%. graduation rates. Let's see. So you can't really tell from most of these, but there's like a dark blue that's certificate of attendance, but otherwise it's received a high school diploma in white. GED is the lightest blue. No high school is like the medium blue, and then the dark blue. High school diploma, GED, enrolled or working towards a GED, and then the dark blue is no high school diploma or no GED or anything like that. So here is American Indian, Alaska Native, 75% graduation rate. That's probably even for me, right up close. It almost looks like an exclamation point if I can't tell. I think that's what it is. But anyway, 12% there with no high school or credential or anything. And as opposed to white, black, Hispanic, Asian. And then this is mixed race here. So, well below the averages for other groups. So this comes from Canada. This is First Nations adults in Canada. The term is First Nations, with any post-secondary degrees. So trade certificate, college diploma, a certificate or diploma with less than a bachelor's degree, and then a university degree. And this is Native people who identify as First Nations Aboriginal, and then those who are living off reservation or living on reservation. So those with a trade or certificate is 13%. College diploma is only 19.4%. And the difference between off reservation versus on reservation is pretty significant, I think, there. And then 3% have a diploma less than a bachelor's degree, and only 8.7% have a university degree. And then again, almost 11% who are off reservation, and only 4.7% for those who are on reservation. Whoops, I just need it there. Yeah. So now this is college enrollment in the United States. So 18 to 24-year-olds who are enrolled in college, it's 24% of Native students as opposed to the overall population, which is 41%. Those who completed college within 6 years for first-time, full-time college students, 41% for Native students and 63% the overall population. So of those who are going to school, many are not staying. Students who received grant aid, 90% of Native students, 77% overall. Students who received federal loans, only 38% of Native students as opposed to 55% overall. And those who live with a parent with a bachelor's degree, it's only 21% for Native students and 52% for overall. Okay, so go back to questions. So the statistics that we just read, and I can flip back if at any point anybody wants to see those again. But clearly, and you know, most of you in this room are educators, so you're not probably completely unfamiliar with this sort of information, right? These statistics are, well, first of all, really concerning, but also having just watched what we watched, right, and talking about what we were talking about this week and last, like, these kinds of things don't just happen out of nowhere, right? Like, there are literal centuries of history that have led up to this, you know, below average performance across the populations of Native students in this country or on this continent. And so I think what's really important to keep in mind and to think about when working with students is what the background is, right? So, to your question, right? Like we didn't, by comparison, have as many people going to boarding schools as many tribes in other areas of the country. But if you go back, 100 or 200 years before that, we've got mission schools here, right? And we talked last week about indentured servitude, and all of the kinds of practices that were happening in boarding schools were happening here earlier in these mission schools, right? Whether it's not, disallowing long hair, disallowing language to be spoken, or, like cruel punishments in school, having children have to go, be taken away from their families and sent into servitude. So all of these kinds of things have happened in different ways for different reasons, but all with this same kind of underlying intention of taking Native people across this country and erasing any sort of cultural identity and any sort of clear cohesion as a group, right? Trying to separate everyone from their family, from their land, from each other. So, we have questions or comments or anything about this? Yeah.
Tom, can you say something about the differences between, the overall way of Native teaching in schools and Western ways?
Yeah. I think that one of the things that's most clear, I think, to me in terms of from a modern perspective, I guess, especially, is the idea that schools typically, right, are kind of designed as a one-size-fits-all, right? So everyone has the same, every fifth grader has the same curriculum, and every fifth grader has to learn X, Y, and Z by the end of the year, and, from my memory as a fifth grader, for example, right, I think a lot of that learning, I think, was a teacher talking and children listening, right? So it was filling the information, filling the kid with the information as opposed to being more exploratory. And granted, I also realized it was a long time ago that I was in fifth grade. And so some things certainly and hopefully have changed. But I think that obviously I work in a school that's designed for Native students, and with many of the other schools that I know of that are designed for Native students, and whether I visited them or have colleagues that work in them, I think what's common across the board for those is that they all specifically model how children learn in their family structure. And so that obviously looks different for one tribal community to the next, but it doesn't necessarily look the same as how we teach as Americans, right? As kind of in the mainstream education system. So I think at Weedamoo School here in Mashpee, the Wampanoag School, it looks like a lot of modeling. It looks like a lot of the teacher doing something or the guest speaker or whoever doing something, and then the kids kind of practicing that thing until they have mastery of it. It looks like a lot of experiential learning, getting, changing the location of education, right? So whether that means, environmental science in the woods or environmental science at the bay, or, learning about, economics by going to the store and, having a bake sale, those kinds of things. And obviously there are limitations to that when you have 100 fifth graders as opposed to 10 or whatever a school might have. But I think that's a large part of the difference. And just from my experience, I think that when there are, students at schools that the teachers are part of their tribal community, then there's obviously going to be more understanding of what some of the challenges are, whether they're specific to a child or they're, community-wide. But some of the things that kids face in a public school, they don't necessarily face in other environments.
Can you tell us more about the Wampanoag School in terms of which children go there? Is it a private school? Is it
Yeah, sure. Weedemoe School is it's a pre-K through grade 3 school for Wampanoag students that right now, like for 4 more days, is a program of the Wampanoag Language Reclamation Project, but it's about to be taken over by the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. Technically it's not a private school, although functionally that's how it runs. It's mostly grant funded and also tribally funded. There are currently 25 students, and there are 2 classrooms. So there's a classroom for ages 3 to 6, which is essentially up through kindergarten, and then a 1st through 3rd grade classroom. And we sort of loosely employ a Montessori curriculum. Most of the teachers are trained Montessorians, although we typically call our school a Wampasori classroom, not a Montessori classroom. So it's Montessori in service to Wampanoag culture. It's not super faithful Montessori. If any of you are Montessorians and you walked into the classroom, you might be like, it looks like Montessori, doesn't always act like Montessori. But some of the foundational principles kind of hold. Montessori is kind of known for like following the child. That's the big thing. And that's something we definitely are, like, we do stick to that very much. So, for example, in our elementary classroom, there are 13 kids in elementary. We have one student who's actually, like, if he were in public school, he'd be in 5th grade. He's our lead teacher's son, so he stays. And we have 3 3rd graders, 3 2nd graders, and 6 1st graders. But they're not necessarily like they're doing whatever work they're doing, right? So they're not necessarily doing 1st grade work because they're 6 or 3rd grade work because they're 9. They're doing wherever they've gotten to. So we have a 3rd grader, for example, who I think is like her English workbook, like she's almost through the 4th grade workbook. She finishes it, we just buy her the next one, So it varies. And then within that model, like each student has an opportunity to like be the youngest and kind of see how things go and follow along, but then eventually they get to a point where they're the leaders in the classroom. Right? And so it's not just through academics that that's the case, but like this year, the elementary classroom, they created outside of their classroom a ceremonial circle, and that was their own idea. It wasn't necessarily part of the curriculum, but they had gone out back behind the tribal building to the real ceremonial circle that's back there at the beginning of the school year and had ceremony back there, and so they decided that they wanted to have that as part of their like everyday, and so they created a circle out there. And they take care of it because it's there, so teachers don't take care of it. So they decided they wanted to paint rocks to go around the sides of it. So they decided that they're gonna that they needed to take a field trip to go collect rocks, and they came back, and so the teachers kind of just facilitated that project that they led. And that happens kind of a lot. A lot of the projects, in elementary in particular, the academic projects have a cultural focus oftentimes. So they, like for example, there was a multiplication lesson that one of our teachers created that was based on loom beadwork. So, how many beads are they going to need if they want to do 10 rows with 12 beads, that kind of thing. To try to incorporate that stuff as much as possible. Sure.
Could you tell us more about Orange Shirt Day? Because I had a 5th grade student come back and tell me a little bit about it, but I was curious if that was like organic or if that's coordinated with the administration of Falmouth and Mashpee and the tribe or what?
Yeah. Actually, Roxanne, you might have a better answer to that, to Orange Shirt Day, because you were part of that process.
I think it came about a little more organically. It actually started in the Office of Victims of Crime within the tribe, and it kind of caught on pretty quickly with employees, and then it kind of spread out to the community. We found ourselves with tribal representatives from education in the Mashpee School working with the young kids to personalize orange t-shirts, of which I think we ordered quite a lot to share with all the kids. And the same thing happened in Falmouth, and I think probably because it didn't come out of education and we were responding to kind of a movement. It didn't come off in Falmouth as well as it might have. So if we were to embrace this in the future, we would have a more organized approach, and the school would be, better prepared as a result of, the work we would do preliminarily with them. So that kind of put the school in a predicament and didn't look very good in the paper, I think. But it really caught on with the community, and so we had multi-generations showing that support. And I think too, in context with the question about how does this context of boarding schools affect Indigenous people in 2023, my family, my children and I are actually a product of having a person in our family whose dad was raised in a boarding school in Oklahoma from the time he was in 1st grade. They talk about putting the kids to work, punishing them, beating them like they were men, and these are children. I know my father-in-law ran off at least twice and was brought back, and his parents were virtually forced to place him in boarding school, as they did his younger siblings. The result of all that is identity, a clash of identity, confusion about your identity, drinking, the lack of, and I think a huge piece, and it may have come across in the film, is a lack of understanding of how to raise children, how to have a family, and convey all the best that parents should be able to convey and kind of get out of having a family, nurturing, because these children weren't nurtured, right? And I think, not to be crude, but if you look at how some pit bulls are raised and how loving they really can be, it's that same concept. And when we talk about it's in our DNA, you just really have to acknowledge and work hard. Because I know my children have to work hard to be not good human beings, but to really convey and take care of their own children and to be those parents as a result, of some of the things they had to go through raising. And I have to be honest, I am a very different person than I might be had I, as we all are because of our young adult lives and thereafter, but as a result of some of those experiences. And until you're educated and able to work through some of that, it really does impact you. And a lot of people go on to get educations, but it's not so much the formal educations, it's the managing of families, relationships, and being healthy. I think that's really what it is. What we all know at this point, what it is to be healthy and to what a healthy family might look like. And I think for all of us, regardless of race, that's that standard, I think, goes throughout race, economics, class, and so forth. So it really, I don't know if I strayed from the original question, but it really does impact. And until such time as Natana said, the truths are laid on the table and dealt with, the healing can't begin. Because there's so many secrets and there's so many, you just don't talk about it, and you don't do it purposely. You don't set out to not talk about it, but people are hurting and dealing with things in their own way. And that's not always a healthy way to deal with things.
I think, like to your point about how, having to learn how to parent, for example, or having to learn how to kind of work through these traumas. I think that's the work of decolonization within tribal communities, right? So I feel like decolonization is like a buzzword, right? Anyone who works with Native people at all, right? Decolonization is it. That's the thing that everyone is aiming for. And of course, in 2023, that's only a possibility to a certain degree, right? Because unless you're gonna go live in the woods somewhere and grow your own food and make your own clothes, that's just not realistic, right? But I think that what is realistic and what I think is the first goal of decolonization is coming back to what Indigenous people can be and should be without all of the trauma garbage, right? And I think whether we know it or not, right? Everyone in this room either knows somebody or has a student who's Wampanoag, for example, or any other tribe, right? And whether we know it as this or not, some of the things that we see that, especially probably those of you as teachers, makes you want to pull out your hair, that's coming from these things, right? A lot of that is not just, some of it is little kid behavior, right? But some of it is not, right? Some of it is really a lot bigger than that. And again, until those things are recognized and talked about and laid on the table, there's not really any way to come out of those things.
Yeah. So your statistics on absenteeism and Wampanoag or even children in special needs and that sort of thing. And I there are several Wampanoag students at the high school that I interact with, and I see that, right? I mean, it's really clear. And and as you just mentioned this, I'm just thinking, I kind of ache to know, what their perspective is, right? As looking from the tribe, looking from that family system that you showed us, or in terms of what their opinion of public education is, and how that affects, and there's gotta be anger there, right? So you're saying unless it's reconciled, there's all this anger that's there, and so that's gonna show up as absenteeism and special needs.
Absolutely. I mean, the original formal education that anyone on this land got was meant to strip culture away, right? And then, you know, the next version of that was maybe just slightly different, but still just equally as traumatizing. And, you know, different variations over the course of centuries had this strict goal of, you know, conforming people into a certain goal. And so, absolutely, that's what happens, right? And just like she's saying with how you raise your children, you raise them based on what you know. You educate your kids based on what you know, and you have an understanding of education based on what you know. And if your parents' and grandparents' education was a total traumatic disaster, then that's what you expect. And that's what you're guarded against.